Hercule Poirot was not a man to be easily puzzled. His little gray cells thrived on complexity, on cases that twisted and turned like a labyrinth. But as he stood in the grand study of Sir Reginald Whitmore's country estate, he found himself momentarily stilled by an oddity, a detail so small yet so striking that it pricked at his mind like a needle. Sir Reginald, a wealthy industrialist known for his rigid routine and punctuality, lay slumped in his high-backed chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes wide open in silent horror. A glass of brandy rested near his limp fingers untouched. His study, meticulously arranged with books and maps, or no sign of forced entry, no struggle, nothing but the ominous tick of the grandfather clock standing in the corner. It was this clock that made Poirot pause. It had just chimed 13 times. Superintendent Harold Clegg, a burly, no-nonsense man, frowned as the final chime echoed through the room. "That blasted thing's been in this house for years, but I've never heard it do that before." Poirot's sharp eyes flicked to the timepiece. A curious thing indeed. A grandfather clock that strikes 13. It is unnatural, no. Dr. Lawrence Metcalfe, the local physician, was examining the body. Dead for at least an hour, perhaps longer. No obvious wounds. A heart attack, possibly, unless the brandy was poisoned. Clegg sniffed. No sign of tampering with the glass. But something's off, I'll grant you that. He turned to the butler, a stiff-looking man named Mr. Graves. Who found him? Graves, who had the air of a man permanently disapproving of the world, answered crisply, "Miss Evelyn. She entered to fetch her father for supper and found him." Like this, Poirot did not miss the slight hesitation before. Like this. People often soften their words when confronted with death, but there was something else, a hesitation of knowledge, not sentiment. "Miss Evelyn is his daughter?" Poirot asked. "Yes," Clegg replied. "And his only child." The lady of the house now, as if summoned, Evelyn Whitmore, entered, pale but composed. She was a striking woman in her late 20s, her dark hair pulled into an elegant twist. Her green eyes, however, betrayed turmoil. "I want to help in any way I can, Monsieur Poirot." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I can't understand how this happened." He was healthy. Poirot's gaze was penetrating. "Mademoiselle, did your father have enemies?" She hesitated. "None that I know of," Clegg sighed. "We'll look into it, but this may well be natural causes." Poirot said nothing. Instead, he walked toward the grandfather clock, resting a hand on its wooden frame. 13 chimes, he murmured. "An old superstition. Some believe it heralds misfortune. But we do not believe in superstitions, do we, my dear Hastings?" Arthur Hastings, Poirot's longtime friend and companion, had been standing silently near the window, surveying the room with a soldier's trained eye. "Certainly not," he said, "though I must say it's a rather odd malfunction." Poirot opened the clock's glass case, examining the inner workings. The mechanism seemed intact, no loose parts, no reason for an extra chime. Then he saw it, a small scrap of paper, wedged inside the clock's housing. Carefully, Poirot extracted it and unfolded the note. The writing was smudged, hurried, but still legible. Midnight. West Wing. Clegg peered over his shoulder. What the devil does that mean? Poirot's eyes gleamed. It means, mon ami, that this crime is not as simple as it seems. A man dies mysteriously. A clock strikes an impossible hour, and a hidden message appears in its workings. Someone, I think, wanted Sir Reginald to meet them in the West Wing at midnight. And perhaps, just perhaps he did. Evelyn exhaled sharply. But that's impossible. My father never used the West Wing. He said it was too draughty, and had it locked up. Poirot turned to the butler. And yet, Monsieur Graves, does it remain locked now? Graves shifted uncomfortably. I believe it is, sir. Then, we shall see, Poirot said, stepping away from the clock with a knowing smile. For when a timepiece defies its nature, it is not by accident. And I suspect that somewhere in this house there is a hand that has set this mystery into motion. The house had settled into uneasy silence, the weight of Sir Reginald Whitmore's death pressing upon its occupants like an unseen hand. Superintendent. Clegg busied himself directing his men, issuing orders in a gruff tone as they searched for anything out of place. Poirot, however, remained still, his gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a man who understood that answers often hid in the most unassuming places. His fingers brushed the surface of Sir Reginald's desk. Everything was neatly arranged, the inkstand aligned with the blotter, the papers stacked in an orderly manner. A man of rigid discipline, then. And yet, something was wrong. Hastings, standing nearby, noticed the flicker of curiosity in Poirot's eyes. What is it? Poirot picked up a pen from the desk and turned it over. Do you observe, mon ami? This pen, it is placed with care, but the nib is broken. A man so meticulous would not leave his writing instrument in such a state. Clegg overheard and let out a scoff. A broken pen? Hardly a murder weapon. Poirot's lips twitched. Not a weapon, but perhaps a clue. He placed the pen down exactly as he had found it, then turned his attention to the brandy glass near the dead man's hand. He studied the liquid, then leaned down, taking the faintest breath of its scent. A moment later, he straightened. Interesting. Hastings raised a brow. What is? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward Evelyn Whitmore, who still stood near the doorway, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes flicking between the detective and her father's lifeless form. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, you were the first to discover him, yes? She nodded. Yes. I came to call him for dinner. The door was closed, but not locked. When I entered, he was like this. And the clock, did it strike 13 while you were in the room? She hesitated. No, it must have done so just after I ran for help. Poirot's gaze did not waver. And you are quite certain that your father had no enemies? Her jaw tightened. I've already told you he was a hard man, yes, but no one wanted him dead. A curious thing, Poirot mused. For a man who leaves behind a note hidden and a clock instructing a secret meeting, yet has no enemies too. Speak of a sharp intake of breath. Evelyn's fingers curled slightly, but she said nothing. Before Poirot could press further, there was a loud crash from the hall. Clegg cursed, spinning toward the door, and a moment later a uniformed officer appeared, looking flustered. Apologies. Sir, one of the side tables, someone knocked it over. Poirot, ever alert, moved past him into the hall. A small wooden table near the staircase lay overturned. Its contents spilled across the floor. A few decorative objects, a porcelain vase in shards, and most curiously a book. He bent down, picking it up. The cover was dark green leather, well worn. When he opened it, he saw the title page, The Laws of Inheritance in England. He turned to Clegg, who had followed him. I imagine you will find this most enlightening, Superintendent, Clegg grunted. What's so special about it? Poirot's fingers tapped the cover. It is not the book itself, but its presence. Why is a legal tome concerning inheritance so conveniently misplaced? And why is it, I wonder, that it fell only now? Evelyn had followed them out, her face unreadable. That book belonged to my father. He often read in the evenings. Did he indeed? Poirot's gaze flicked toward the west wing. And yet, this book tells me that perhaps someone in this house had more than casual interest in what happens after a man's death. There was a heavy silence. Then a new voice, smooth and unhurried. That would hardly be a surprise, Monsieur Poirot. My uncle was, after all, a very wealthy man. Poirot turned to see a tall figure descending the stairs. The man's features were sharp, his dark hair combed back with precision. There was an undeniable resemblance to Sir Reginald, though his demeanor lacked the rigidity of the elder Whitmore. And you are? Poirot inquired. Victor Whitmore, the man said easily. Sir Reginald's nephew. Poirot studied him for a moment. I was under the impression that Sir Reginald's only close relative was his daughter. Victor's lips curved slightly. Indeed, but I have been abroad for some time. I returned only yesterday. A fortunate coincidence, no? Poirot did not answer immediately. His mind was already working, fitting the pieces together. The clock that struck 13, a note hidden inside, a broken pen, a misplaced book on inheritance, and now a nephew who appeared only after his uncle's sudden death. Fortune, Poirot murmured, is a matter of perspective, Monsieur Whitmore. But I do not believe in coincidences. Poirot studied Victor Whitmore with the sharp gaze of a man who had long since learned that appearances were but a mask. The nephew stood at the foot of the stairs with a casual ease, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. A man who had only just returned after years away, only to find his uncle dead. Yet he seemed neither shocked nor particularly mournful. Tell me, Monsieur Whitmore, Poirot said, his voice smooth but pointed, what was your purpose in returning to England? Victor's lips twitched, though whether in amusement or calculation, it was difficult to tell. Family, of course. My uncle and I may not have been particularly close, but blood is blood. I thought it time to mend bridges, Evelyn scoffed softly. How convenient that you decided to mend bridges just before my father died. Victor turned to her, his expression cool. Are you implying I had something to do with it? Poirot raised a hand before Evelyn could respond. Oh, let us not rush to accusations just yet, non. I find it much more productive to let the truth reveal itself. His gaze flicked briefly toward the overturned table. Tell me, Monsieur Whitmore, did you see this book before it fell? Victor followed his gaze, his brow furrowing slightly. Not at all. I didn't touch anything. Curious, Poirot murmured. Because you see, it was not on the floor when I arrived. Victor held his gaze for a moment, then shrugged. Perhaps someone knocked it over without noticing. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wished to hide its significance. Clegg cleared his throat. All right, enough dancing around. Let's get back to business. The staff and family members are to be questioned one by one. He turned. To Evelyn first. Miss Whitmore, where were you between 11 and midnight? I was in my room, she answered without hesitation. Reading, and did you hear anything unusual? She glanced toward the study. Nothing until I entered and found my father. Then the clock. It struck 13. Poirot's fingers twitched. And yet, Mademoiselle, that is not quite correct. Evelyn stiffened slightly. What do you mean? You told me earlier that you found your father first. Then the clock struck 13 only after you ran for help. But if that were the case, then the timing would be most unusual. Why did the clock not chime upon the hour? Why did it wait? A flicker of something nervousness crossed her face, but she recovered quickly. I don't know. I was in shock. Poirot gave a small nod, as though satisfied, though Hastings could tell his mind was still turning. Next, the butler, Mr. Graves, was called forward. His posture remained as rigid as ever, his hands neatly clasped behind his back. Mr. Graves, Clegg said, where were you around the time of Sir Reginald's death? In the servants' quarters, Superintendent. His voice was measured, unwavering. I had just finished preparing for the night when I heard Miss Evelyn cry out, You were the first to reach her? Poirot inquired. Yes. I escorted her out of the study while Dr. Metcalfe was called. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And tell me, Monsieur Graves, was the door to the west wing locked when last you checked? Graves hesitated. It should be. Sir Reginald rarely had reason to go there, but I did not check it personally last night. And has anyone else asked for access to it in recent days? Again, a slight hesitation. Not that I am aware of. Poirot tilted his head. You do not sound entirely certain, monsieur. Graves' jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Clegg grunted. What about the clock? You've worked here long enough. Has it ever struck 13 before? The butler's lips thinned. Never, sir. Poirot studied him for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing Dr. Metcalfe to take his turn. The doctor, still adjusting his spectacles, seemed slightly irritated by the entire process. Dr. Metcalfe, Clegg began. You examined the body. You're certain there were no signs of struggle? None, Metcalfe said briskly. No external wounds, no signs of violence, and yet, Poirot interjected, he did not die of natural causes, did he? Metcalfe hesitated. That remains to be determined, but you suspect poisoning, the doctor exhaled sharply. I won't confirm anything without a proper examination, but yes, it is possible. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Possible, or likely. Another hesitation. Likely, Evelyn gasped softly, but Victor simply leaned against the banister. Watching, Poirot turned to Clegg. Then, mon cher superintendent, I believe you have a most intriguing case before you. A death with no visible cause, a clock that defies nature, and a family full of secrets, Clegg scowled. And a room we've yet to check the west wing. Poirot smiled slightly. Ah, yes. The room our victim was meant to visit at midnight. His fingers traced the edge of his cuff as he turned toward the dim hallway. I do believe it is time we see what Sir Reginald was meant to find. Before death found him first, the corridor leading to the west wing was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and disuse. Poirot moved with careful precision, his sharp eyes noting every detail as the group advanced. Clegg grumbled about the lateness of the hour, while Hastings kept close behind, ever observant of his friend's unspoken thoughts. Evelyn and Victor followed at a distance, the tension between them palpable. The butler, Graves, remained stone-faced, but his hands were clasped tighter than before. Reaching the heavy oak door, Poirot hesitated only for a moment before pushing it open. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a room frozen in time. The air smelled of old books and aged wood, the faint scent of pipe tobacco still lingering as though Sir Reginald had only just been here. Poirot's gaze swept the room. A writing desk sat in one corner, an unlit fireplace on the opposite wall, and against the far end, a glass cabinet containing a collection of rare artifacts. But what drew his attention immediately was the dust, or rather, the absence of it. Ah, he murmured, stepping forward. Most interesting, Clegg frowned. What now? Poirot pointed toward the cabinet. Do you see, Superintendent? The room is undisturbed except for this. The dust on the floor is thick, yet there are faint impressions of movement near this cabinet. Someone was here recently. Victor let out a soft chuckle. So what? This was my uncle's house. He had every right to be here. Poirot's gaze flicked to him. Oui, but your uncle is dead. And before he died, he was meant to meet someone here. The question is who, Victor's. Smirk faded slightly, but he said nothing. Poirot turned his attention to the cabinet, examining it closely before gently pulling it open. Inside were several neatly arranged items, small statues, antique coins, a few rare books. But one section of the shelf had been disturbed. A faint smudge marked where something had once rested, now missing. A theft? Hastings murmured. Poirot tapped his chin. Perhaps. Or perhaps something was hidden here that someone wished to retrieve. Evelyn's voice was tense. My father didn't deal in stolen goods. If that's what you're suggesting. Poirot turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Mademoiselle, you are very firm in stating that your father had no enemies. But I wonder, did you know everything about him? His business dealings, his past? She faltered. Of course, I did, and yet, Poirot said softly, You seem very certain for someone who has yet to learn what was taken. A silence stretched between them. Before Clegg, ever impatient, cleared his throat. We'll have to check what's missing later. Right now, let's get back to what matters. You're saying this wasn't just a murder, there's something bigger here? Poirot nodded. Indeed, Superintendent. Consider Sir Reginald was found dead with no signs of struggle and likely poisoned. Yet a clock strikes 13, a deliberate signal, not a coincidence. And now we discover that he was meant to meet someone here, just before his death, in a room that has been recently disturbed. His fingers tapped the glass of the cabinet. Non, this was no simple crime of passion or impulse. This was planned. And at the heart of it, his gaze swept over them all, lingering briefly on each face, lies a motive that someone is desperate to conceal. Victor sighed dramatically. Then let's talk about motive, shall we? You think one of us had a reason to kill him? Let's go down the list. He gestured toward Evelyn. His daughter who inherits everything. Evelyn's face flushed with anger. You dare accuse me? Victor ignored her, looking toward Graves. The butler loyal, but how loyal? Maybe there was something worth more than his service. Graves' lips pressed together, but he remained silent. And of course, there's Dr. Metcalfe, a respected physician, but with access to poisons. A bit too convenient, don't you think? The doctor bristled. How dare you? Victor spread his hands. I'm simply pointing out that we all had potential motives. His gaze sharpened as he looked back at Poirot. And yet, you haven't said a word about me. Why is that? Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but I do not need to, monsieur. You are already quite eager to defend yourself. Victor stiffened, but before he could respond, Hastings spoke. So where does that leave us? Everyone here could have had a reason, but none of it explains everything. Poirot's gaze darkened slightly. Not yet, mon ami. But let us consider what if Sir Reginald had something in his possession that was dangerous. Not simply valuable, but something worth killing for. Clegg frowned. You mean something in that cabinet? Poirot nodded. Perhaps. Or perhaps something that was never meant to be found. His fingers trailed over the dust once more. But the truth, it will come, mes amis. And when it does, it will reveal not just a murderer, but a deception far deeper than we have yet imagined. A sharp knock echoed through the study as Superintendent Clegg entered with an air of finality, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. Behind him, a constable carried a small tray with a delicate crystal glass, retrieved from Sir Reginald's desk, its contents now confirmed to contain traces of poison. Clegg's expression was one of satisfaction as he set down a folded report with a decisive thud. Well, Poirot, I believe we have our answer. His eyes flicked toward Dr. Metcalfe, who stood with his arms crossed, the usual irritation in his expression edged with something more unsettled. The poison in Sir Reginald's system matches what was found in this glass. Someone handed him a fatal drink, and I have a good idea who. Poirot tilted his head, his fingers lightly pressing together. Do tell, mon cher Superintendent. Clegg turned toward Graves, the butler, who remained as rigid as ever, though the faintest tightening of his jaw betrayed him. Mr. Graves was the last person to serve Sir Reginald anything that night, and seeing as our dear employer was poisoned, well, the answer seems rather obvious, doesn't it?" Evelyn let out a sharp breath. "That's absurd. Graves has been with our family for years." "And yet," Clegg continued, "there are no signs of forced entry, no struggle. Whoever did this had to be someone Sir Reginald trusted." He gestured toward the constable. "We found this in the servants' quarters, hidden beneath a pile of linens." The constable stepped forward, revealing a small amber bottle with a simple label. "Digitalis," Clegg announced, "a powerful toxin taken from foxglove plants. Common enough in medicinal use, but deadly in the wrong hands." He turned back to Graves. "Care to explain?" The butler's lips pressed into a thin line. "I have nothing to say." "Aha," Poirot murmured, stepping forward with careful precision. "But you see, Monsieur Graves, that is precisely what concerns me. You, who have served Sir Reginald with unwavering loyalty, now stand accused of murder, and yet you do not protest." Graves' fingers twitched at his side, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Perhaps," Clegg said, "because he knows he's caught." "There's no need to deny the truth." Poirot studied the bottle, the glass, and then Graves himself. "None," he said finally, shaking his head. "Something is wrong." Clegg scowled. "Wrong? What more do you need?" Poirot gestured toward the evidence. "Let us consider, mon ami. The poison was found in Sir Reginald's drink, yes? And this bottle, hidden away in the butler's quarters, too conveniently placed, if you ask me. If Monsieur Graves had indeed poisoned his employer, why would he keep such damning evidence in his own room?" "People panic," Clegg said gruffly. "He might have forgotten to dispose of it." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but monsieur, Graves does not strike me as a man who forgets. Look at him, every button perfectly in place, every word carefully measured. No, if he wished to kill, he would not make such an obvious mistake." Evelyn turned to Graves, her voice pleading. "If you know something, you must speak now." Graves' jaw tightened. "My duty was to serve the household, not to betray its secrets." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, but a secret already betrayed is no longer worth keeping. Nest C. Pause." He took a step closer, his voice gentle but insistent. "Tell me, Monsieur Graves, did Sir Reginald say anything unusual before his death? Did he seem troubled?" Graves hesitated for the briefest moment. "He received a letter," he admitted at last. "I delivered it myself." He read it in silence, then locked it away in his desk drawer. Poirot's brow arched. A letter? And yet no such letter was found among his things. Clegg muttered a curse, turning sharply to the constable. "Search the room again. Every drawer, every compartment." The constable nodded and set to work, while Clegg turned back to Poirot. "So what? Maybe the letter upset him. Maybe Graves took advantage of that." Poirot shook his head. "No, Superintendent. You are too eager to close the case. Tell me who benefits most from this crime, who gains the most from Sir Reginald's death." Evelyn's voice was cold. "I've already told you I inherit." Everything. If this is your way of accusing me, you can save your breath." Poirot turned his gaze to Victor. "And you, monsieur? Your return was quite sudden, was it not?" Victor scoffed. "Oh, come now, Poirot. If I wanted my uncle's money, I wouldn't have waited for poison. I would have convinced him to change." His will, Poirot gave a small nod, conceding the point, but his eyes remained thoughtful. The constable straightened suddenly. "Sir, I found something from the depths of Sir Reginald's desk." He produced a torn envelope, the paper crisp but aged. Poirot accepted it with great care, his fingers smoothing over the name written across the front. His expression darkened. "It is as I feared," he murmured. Hastings peered over his shoulder. "What does it say?" Poirot pulled the letter from the envelope, his eyes scanning the words with keen focus. The handwriting was neat but hastily written, the ink slightly smudged. "Reginald, you cannot keep this hidden forever. If you do not return what was taken, there will be consequences." Midnight. The West Wing. No signature. No indication of the sender. Only the ominous warning. Evelyn's face paled. What does this mean? Poirot folded the letter carefully. "It means, mademoiselle, that this was never about money. It was never about inheritance." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "It was about something far older and far more dangerous." Clegg exhaled sharply. "You're saying this wasn't just murder? It was a threat carried out?" Poirot nodded. "And the true culprit is still among us, waiting for the right moment to strike again." Poirot held the letter delicately between his fingertips, his sharp gaze tracing the inked words as if they alone held the key to the mystery. Around him, the room hummed with a taut silence. Hastings, standing beside him, shifted uneasily. Superintendent Clegg remained skeptical, arms crossed, while Evelyn, Victor, and Graves all bore their own expressions of uncertainty and unease. At last, Poirot spoke, his voice measured. "You see, mes amis, this crime is not one born of mere greed or opportunity. No, it is an echo and unresolved matter that has festered in the shadows for years." He tapped the letter. "This is not the demand of a desperate thief. It is the voice of an old wound reopening." Victor scoffed. "That's all well and good, Poirot, but what exactly are you suggesting?" "That my uncle was involved in some past scandal?" Poirot's lips twitched. "Scandal, perhaps, or something even more unspeakable." The detective turned toward Graves, who had remained impassive throughout the exchange. "Monsieur Graves, you have served this household for many years. Tell me, did Sir Reginald ever mention a past regret? A secret he kept hidden?" The butler hesitated, his face unreadable. "He was a man of many regrets, monsieur, as most men of power tend to be. But he never spoke of them aloud." Poirot watched him carefully. "None? Then perhaps you can tell me of the West Wing." A subtle tension rippled through the room. Graves' lips pressed into a thin line. Evelyn exchanged a wary glance with Victor. Even Superintendent Clegg's frown deepened. "The West Wing has been closed for years," Evelyn said slowly. "My uncle had it locked after my father died Poirot's brow arched. Your father? Evelyn nodded. Henry, my uncle's younger brother. He died in an accident when I was a child. An accident, you say? Poirot's voice was light, but his eyes gleamed with something sharper. Victor spoke next, a grim edge in his voice. A hunting accident. Or at least, that's what my uncle always claimed. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. And yet, I sense that this story is not so simple. What if I were to tell you that your uncle's murder is not merely a crime of the present, but a reckoning long overdue? The words lingered in the air like an unspoken curse. Hastings shifted, glancing at the others. I say, Poirot, you're not suggesting that this all ties back to Henry's death, are you? Poirot stopped, his sharp gaze flickering between the faces before him. Let us consider the facts. Sir Reginald received a letter one demanding that he return what was taken. This was no plea for money, no blackmail over present misdeeds. No, it was something older, something buried. He turned back to Evelyn. Mademoiselle, you said that after your father's passing, the west wing was locked. Tell me what was kept there. Evelyn hesitated, as if searching her memory. Nothing of importance. It was mostly storage. Old furniture, books. My father's things, Poirot nodded. And was it ever opened after? Graves spoke this time, his voice low. Not that I am aware of. The key was always kept in Sir Reginald's possession. Poirot turned to Clegg. Then, mon ami, I believe it is time we visited this west wing ourselves. The west wing had an air of abandonment, its heavy doors groaning as they swung open. Dust swirled in the dim light, the scent of aged wood, and forgotten years thick in the air. The room beyond was lined with old bookshelves, covered furniture, and crates stacked neatly along the walls. The space felt untouched, preserved like a time capsule from a past no one wished to remember. Poirot stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room. Tell me, Hastings, what do you see? Hastings frowned. A lot of dust and a load of old junk. Poirot smiled. Oh, but that is merely the surface. He moved with careful precision, his eyes searching. He stopped at an old writing desk, his fingers brushing over the wood before he tried the drawer. Locked. His lips pursed, curious. Clegg sighed. Shall I have it forced open? Poirot lifted a hand. Patience, mon ami. The answer lies within reach. He turned to Graves. The key, if you please. Graves hesitated then. Produced a small ring of keys from his coat. He selected one and handed it to Poirot, who slid it into the lock. With a quiet click, the drawer opened. Inside lay a single item, a faded leather journal. Poirot lifted it carefully, brushing away a layer of dust before opening the cover. The name inscribed inside made his expression darken. Henry Latham. Evelyn inhaled sharply. My father's journal. Poirot flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the words. The ink was smudged in places, the writing hurried. But the words carried weight, a confession whispered from the grave. I cannot stay silent any longer. Reginald thinks he has buried the past, But the truth will not stay hidden. I saw what he did. I know what he took. If he does not make it right, I will Poirot close the journal, his grip firm. He turned to the others. Now, mes amis, the picture becomes clearer. Sir Reginald did not simply lose his brother, he betrayed him. Clegg frowned. But what does this mean? What did Sir Reginald take? Poirot's gaze drifted toward the old bookshelves. He stepped closer, his fingers running along the spines until they paused on a thick, worn volume. He pulled it, and with a quiet creak, the shelf shifted. A small compartment revealed itself behind the wood paneling. Inside sat a small velvet-lined box. Poirot lifted it carefully, then opened it. A single ring lay inside. A heavy gold signet engraved with the Latham family crest. Victor frowned. A ring? That's what this is about. Poirot held it up. Not just any ring, monsieur. This is a symbol of power, of inheritance. He turned to Evelyn. Your father was the rightful heir to the Latham estate, was he not? Evelyn's breath caught. Yes. But after his death, my uncle, she stopped, realization dawning in her eyes. You're saying he took it? Poirot nodded. Sir, Reginald ensured that the legacy, the inheritance, remained his. And someone who knew the truth decided it was time to take it back. Clegg muttered a curse. So this wasn't just revenge. It was justice. Poirot turned the ring in his fingers. The past does not remain buried, mon ami. It merely waits. Until the time is right, Poirot turned the signet ring in his fingers, its golden surface catching the dim light of the west wing. The weight of it was more than mere metal. It was history, inheritance, and betrayal, all forged into one small object. He placed it back into the velvet-lined box with careful precision, before shutting it with a quiet snap. Around him, the room seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn's voice broke the silence. So this was my father's ring? Poirot inclined. His head. It was meant to be. But it remained with Sir Reginald instead. Victor shook his head. Even if my uncle took the ring all those years ago, why now? Why kill him over it after all this time? Poirot's lips pressed together. In thought. Ah, mon ami, time is a curious thing. It buries secrets, but it does not erase them. Someone has waited patiently for the right moment to strike. And strike they did. Superintendent Clegg, arms crossed, frowned. You've established motive, Poirot, but we're still left with too many suspects. He cast a glance at Graves. Evelyn and Victor. Everyone here had access to the house. Any of them could have done it. Poirot nodded, stepping away from the hidden compartment. Indeed. Which is why, mes amis, we must find a way to narrow the field. His gaze flickered to Graves. Monsieur Graves, you have served this household for many years, non? The butler's face remained impassive. Yes, monsieur, Poirot smiled. And in that time, you have come to know its inhabitants well. Their habits, their tempers, their secrets. Graves' expression did not change. I know what is necessary, sir. Poirot nodded. Bean. Then you will no doubt be able to assist me in a small test. Hastings, who had been listening with increasing curiosity, raised an eyebrow. A test, Poirot. Poirot's gaze swept across the room, considering each individual in turn. A simple matter, mon ami. You see, I believe the killer has told us who they are without even realizing it. A deception, however careful, always contains a flaw. Evelyn frowned. What do you mean? Poirot's smile was small but knowing. Allow me to demonstrate. He moved toward the old writing desk and placed the velvet box on its surface. Then, with great care, he turned the signet ring inside, so that it was slightly askew, barely noticeable, but just enough to unsettle someone who had an intimate connection to it. Then he stepped back. Now, he said, with the air of a man who had just laid a trap, I must ask each of you to step forward and close the box. Clegg sighed. Poirot, this hardly seems, mon ami, Poirot interrupted, lifting a finger. Patience, with a skeptical glance, Clegg gestured to Evelyn. Might as well get on with it. Evelyn stepped forward, hesitating. Only briefly before she reached out and shut the box with a quiet click. Poirot nodded, giving nothing away. Victor followed, his movements brisk, almost impatient. He pressed the lid down and stepped back, arms crossed. Finally, it was Graves. Turn. The butler stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His gloved fingers reached for the box, but as he moved to shut it, he hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. Poirot caught at the brief flicker of recognition, the faint twitch of the fingers as they instinctively adjusted the ring's position inside. Before snapping the box shut, Poirot exhaled softly. Merci, Monsieur Graves. The butler stepped back, but Poirot had already turned to Clegg. His voice was quiet, but firm. You have your man. A stunned silence filled the room. Evelyn looked between Poirot and the butler in disbelief. Victor's eyes narrowed. Clegg, however, remained skeptical. That's it? A hesitation? Poirot shook his head. Not just a hesitation. A reflex. A man who has never seen that ring before would not think twice about its placement. But someone who knew it well, who had touched it before, who had hidden it away in that compartment, that person, they would seek to correct the error. Even if only for a moment, Graves' jaw tightened. That's a flimsy accusation, monsieur. Poirot's eyes glowed with certainty. Oh, but it is not the only thing, is it? He took a step closer. You have served this house for decades. You have known its secrets. And yet, despite all your years of loyal service, you remained when Sir Reginald fell ill. Not out of duty, but out of patience. You were waiting, were you not? The butler's silence was its own confession. Poirot continued, his voice softer now. You knew Henry Latham. You knew what happened to him was no accident. And you knew Sir Reginald had stolen what was not his. But you could do nothing. Not then. So you waited. Until the moment was right. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. Graves, is this true? The old butler's face, usually so composed, finally cracked. His fingers twitched at his sides before curling into tight fists. His voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. "Your father. He was my friend." He swallowed, looking at Evelyn with something like sorrow. "I served this house, but my loyalty was to him. And when he died, when I saw Sir Reginald claim everything that was his, I vowed I would not let it go unanswered." Poirot's expression did not waver. "And so you waited until time did what justice could not." Graves exhaled shakily. "I wanted him to confess. I wanted him to admit it, but he never did." His eyes darkened. "So I took matters into my own hands." Clegg stepped forward, his posture stiff with authority. "That's enough. Arthur. Graves, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Latham." Graves didn't resist. As the cuffs were placed around his wrists, his gaze met Evelyn's once more. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "but justice was long overdue." Poirot sighed, watching as Graves was led away. He turned back to Evelyn and Victor, their faces pale with shock. "The past does not remain buried," Poirot said softly. "It merely waits for someone to dig it up." As the heavy doors of the estate closed behind the departing police escort, the tension in the room lingered like an unwelcome guest. Poirot remained still, his sharp eyes studying the faces before him, Evelyn, pale and shaken, Victor, tense and unreadable. The confession of Arthur Graves had unraveled decades of buried secrets, yet Poirot's mind remained troubled. The pieces had fallen into place too cleanly, too swiftly. He stepped toward the old writing desk, where the velvet box still sat. His fingers brushed against the lid before flipping it open once more. The signet ring rested inside undisturbed. He turned it slightly, watching how the dim light caught the engraved crest. A symbol of legacy, deception, and betrayal, yet something about it continued to gnaw at him. Superintendent Clegg, still standing nearby, folded his arms. "Well, Poirot, I suppose that's that. Graves all but confessed, didn't he?" Poirot did not look up. "Oui, mon ami. And yet, I find myself uneasy." Victor exhaled sharply. "You've caught the man responsible. What else is there to be uneasy about?" Poirot straightened, his hands clasping neatly in front of him. "A confession can be a convenient thing, monsieur. Sometimes it is given in desperation, sometimes out of guilt, and sometimes." His gaze flicked toward the grand fireplace, where the embers still smoldered to protect someone else. Victor scoffed. "Protect who?" "He said it himself. He wanted justice for my uncle's crime. If you ask me, it was long overdue." Poirot studied Victor for a moment before shaking his head. "Non. The timing, it does not fit. If revenge was his only motive, why wait until now? Why not act years ago, when Sir Reginald first grew ill, when he was at his weakest?" Evelyn spoke, her voice soft but certain. "Because of the ring." Poirot turned to her. "Ah, you see it too, mademoiselle?" She nodded. "It wasn't just about my father's death. Graves must have known the ring was hidden somewhere in this house. Maybe he waited until he could find it before confronting my uncle. But when he finally did," she hesitated. "Something went wrong." Poirot tapped a finger against his temple. "Exactement. But what?" Before anyone could answer, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the silence, a muffled crash from the hallway beyond. Clegg's hand immediately went to his holster. Poirot, moving with surprising speed, crossed the room and pulled the door open. The corridor was dimly lit, the long shadows stretching across the polished floors. At the far end, just near the grand staircase, a figure darted away, a brief blur of movement before vanishing into the darkness. Poirot's keen eyes dropped to the floor, where the source of the noise lay in plain sight, a small wooden display case shattered upon impact. But it was not the case itself that drew his attention. It was what was missing from it. The velvet-lined interior had held something only moments ago. Now it was empty. Clegg cursed. What was in there? Poirot's expression darkened. A letter, Evelyn gasped. The one my uncle kept locked away? The one about my father? Victor paled. Someone's trying to cover their tracks. Poirot turned sharply. Non, mon ami. Someone is trying to rewrite history before we can read the truth. Clegg was already moving toward the staircase, barking orders to his constables. Lock down the estate. No one leaves. Poirot, however, remained still. His mind worked rapidly, turning over the details with relentless precision. The confession of Graves had been too perfect, and now, at the moment of revelation, the last piece of evidence had conveniently disappeared. His fingers tightened around the edge of the broken display case. No, this was not the work of a desperate butler seeking vengeance. This was something else, a game of misdirection. A final attempt to bury the past before the truth could surface, and Poirot, now more than ever, was determined to unearth it. The weight of the stolen letter pressed heavily on Poirot's mind as he paced the grand study, his polished shoes gliding soundlessly across the rug. The shattered display case had been swiftly examined, but no prints, no clue remained, just absence, a void where the past had been forcibly erased. Evelyn sat stiffly in the chair, fingers twisting together, while Victor stood near the fireplace. His arms crossed, tension evident in the set of his jaw. Superintendent Clegg had his men searching every room, though Poirot suspected they would find nothing. The thief had been careful, yet just as the detective considered his next move, the silence was broken by a scream, a woman's cry, sharp and filled with panic, echoed through the corridors, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Poirot turned swiftly, his mind already racing. He recognized that voice, Mrs. Lillian Harcourt, the housekeeper. He moved quickly, Evelyn and Victor following close behind as they reached the grand hallway. Mrs. Harcourt stood at the foot of the staircase, one trembling hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointing wildly toward the upper landing. It's him, in the master's room. Poirot did not hesitate, ascending the stairs 2 at a time. He had spent enough time at Thornfield Manor to know exactly where he was headed. The grand master bedroom Sir Reginald's old chamber had remained locked since his passing, undisturbed except for the occasional visit from the staff. The door stood ajar, swaying slightly as though it had only just been opened. Poirot pushed it wide. The air inside was thick, still carrying traces of dust from neglect. The heavy drapes were drawn, casting long shadows in the dim candlelight. But it was not the room's eerie stillness that made Poirot pause. It was the figure sprawled on the carpet. Arthur Graves lay motionless, his head turned at an unnatural angle, a dark crimson stain spreading beneath him. Victor exhaled sharply behind him. Evelyn gasped, her hands flying to her lips. Poirot crouched immediately, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Graves' body had not been here long. The blood was still fresh, pooling thickly against the rug's intricate embroidery. No weapon was in sight, no sign of struggle. Just the quiet certainty of death. Clegg arrived moments later, cursing as he took in the sight before him. "Damn it, Poirot, we just had him in custody." He turned to his men. "Lock this house down. I want everyone accounted for. No one leaves. Do you hear me?" Poirot remained silent, his fingertips resting gently against Graves' coat. The butler's face was frozen in something resembling surprise, as though death had taken him before he could react. "This is no ordinary crime," Poirot murmured at last. "This is the work of a mind that anticipates every move before we can make it." Victor stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You think someone silenced him?" Poirot nodded. "It is too convenient, n'est-ce pas? The confession, the missing letter, and now this. None, my friends. Graves was not the mastermind behind this affair. He was merely another piece on the board. And someone has just removed him from play." Evelyn shuddered. "But who?" Poirot rose to his feet, dusting his hands off on his lapels. "That is the question we must answer. And we must answer it quickly before the next move is made." He turned toward the window, his gaze narrowing as he considered the darkened grounds beyond. Somewhere out there, hidden within the estate's long corridors or its endless shadows, the true orchestrator of this deception was waiting. And if Poirot had learned one thing tonight, it was this: whoever they were not done yet. Poirot stood in the master bedroom, the weight of the crime pressing upon him. Arthur Graves' body lay still, the crimson stain seeping into the antique rug. Yet it was not the sight of death that held his attention. It was the silence that followed. A silence not of peace, but calculation. Somewhere in this house, the true criminal was listening, watching, waiting. Superintendent Clegg barked orders to his men, demanding a full search, but Poirot barely registered the noise. His mind was elsewhere, retracing every step, every word spoken that night. The pattern was there just beneath the surface, like a painting hidden beneath layers of dust. His gaze fell upon Graves' right hand. It was curled slightly, as if he had grasped at something before his final breath. Poirot knelt, carefully lifting the stiff fingers. A faint smudge of ink stained the tip's fresh ink. The butler had touched something moments before his death. Poirot's eyes flickered across the room. A writing desk sat against the far wall, an inkwell placed neatly at its center. He moved swiftly, his fingers grazing the polished wood. A single sheet of parchment lay beside it, blank except for a faint smear of ink at the corner, as though something had been hastily wiped away, a disturbance in the stillness. A hand reaching for something before being struck down, a realization settled. In Poirot's mind, Graves had known something. and he had been about to write it down. Clegg was beside him now. Poirot, what is it? Poirot straightened. Mon cher, do you not see? The butler was silenced before he could reveal something. But what did he wish to write? Evelyn and Victor hovered near the doorway, their expressions tight with unease. Poirot turned sharply to them. Tell me, Graves, did he have any peculiar habits? Did he ever take notes, keep records? Victor hesitated. He was meticulous. He kept a small notebook with him always. Evelyn's eyes widened. I saw it earlier tonight. He had it when you first questioned him in the parlor. Poirot's pulse quickened. Then where is it now? Clegg frowned, nodding to one of his officers. Search him. The constable knelt beside the body, patting down the pockets of Graves. Waistcoat and coat. Nothing. He checked the trouser pockets. Empty. Poirot exhaled sharply. Then it has been taken. Clegg's features darkened. By who? Poirot glanced around the room once more. The killer had no time to search Graves. After striking him down not when the housekeeper's scream had brought half the household running. That meant the notebook had been taken before the murder. Someone had known Graves had written something damning. Someone had ensured it was never read. Poirot turned back to Evelyn and Victor. His gaze lingered on Evelyn a fraction longer. Then, softly, he asked, Mademoiselle, when you last saw the notebook, was Graves alone? She hesitated. No, I don't think so. Lady Montrose was with him. The name sent a ripple through the room. Lady Beatrice Montrose, the grieving widow. The woman who had, until now, remained largely in the background. Poirot's mind clicked the pieces into place. A pattern long obscured, now clear as day. The clock that had struck 13. The stolen letter. The missing notebook. Lady Montrose had been present at each turn of the investigation. And yet, until now, she had avoided suspicion entirely. Poirot turned on his heel, striding toward the hallway. We must find Lady Montrose, he declared, his voice firm. For I believe she holds the final key to this mystery. Poirot moved swiftly through the dimly lit corridor, his mind racing ahead of his feet. The pieces of the puzzle had aligned. But there remained one final layer, something buried deep beneath the obvious motives of greed, inheritance, and secrecy. Lady Montrose had played a careful game, but what had truly driven her to such extremes? As he approached the drawing room, the air was thick with unease. Inside, Lady Beatrice Montrose sat composed, her black mourning dress impeccable, her hands folded over her lap. Her expression was one of quiet sorrow, yet there was something else, an air of expectation, as though she had been waiting for this moment. Poirot entered without hesitation, Clegg close behind. Evelyn and Victor lingered. In the doorway, their eyes darting between the detective and the woman at the heart of the mystery, Poirot inclined his head slightly. Lady Montrose, I must speak with you. Her gaze met his, cool and measured. I assume this concerns the death of Mr. Graves? He nodded. Among other things, for a moment, silence settled between them. Then Poirot took a slow step forward. Your husband, Lord Montrose, was a man of wealth, influence. And secrets, was he not? A flicker of something passed across her face, gone as quickly as it appeared. He was a private man, yes. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. And yet, his past was not as private as you might have hoped. Tell me, Lady Montrose, were you aware that Mr. Graves had come into possession of a letter concerning your husband's past? A slight stiffening of her posture. A barely perceptible intake of breath. I don't know what you mean, she said carefully. Poirot's voice softened. Ah, but you do, madam. That letter contained a truth you have fought desperately to keep buried. A truth that goes beyond inheritance or money. A truth about your husband's past. And your own. Victor took a sharp breath. Evelyn clutched at the door frame, her knuckles white. Lady Montrose's lips thinned, but she did not speak. Poirot pressed on. Many years ago, your husband was not the man society believed him to be. He was not born a Montrose, was he? Silence, Poirot continued, his tone growing gentler. No, he was born under another name, a name long forgotten to those who did not wish to see it again. He remade himself, rising in stature, leaving behind the sins of his youth. But as you well know, the past does not remain buried forever. Clegg frowned. What are you saying, Poirot? Poirot turned to him. Lord Montrose was not merely a nobleman. He was once a man involved in a crime long before his title shielded him. A crime that led to the ruin of another family. His eyes flickered back to Lady Montrose. A family that never forgot. She exhaled, slow and controlled. You are well informed, Monsieur Poirot. He inclined his head. I make it my business to be. She rose to her feet, stepping toward the fireplace, her fingers grazing the mantelpiece. Yes, my husband changed his name. Yes, he left his past behind. But what you do not understand, Monsieur Poirot, is that past never left us. There were threats, letters that came over the years, reminders of what had been. When that letter surfaced, the one Graves found, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Evelyn whispered, what was in the letter? Poirot answered for her. It was proof that Lord Montrose was responsible for a betrayal many years ago, one that cost a man his fortune and his life. The rightful heir to an estate was tricked out of his inheritance. His family left destitute while Montrose took everything. He turned back to Lady Montrose. You feared that revelation, did you not? For if it were made public, not only would your husband's legacy crumble, but your son's future as well. Victor stepped forward. You killed Graves. For that? To protect a legacy built on lies? Lady Montrose turned, her gaze steady. I did not kill Graves. Poirot lifted a brow. Ah, but you did something equally damning. You took the notebook before he could reveal its contents. And when the time came, you said nothing as he was silenced forever. Her fingers curled against the mantelpiece. I had to protect my family, Poirot sighed. At what cost, madam? A second crime built atop the first. Graves was no blackmailer. He was an honest man who intended to do what was right. He paused. And yet, I believe there is something even deeper at play. A silence stretched across the room. Poirot's voice dropped to a murmur. "Tell me, Lady Montrose, who truly had the most to lose if Graves spoke?" She froze. Poirot stepped closer. "It was not just you, was it? You acted out of fear, yes, but not just for yourself. There was someone else." Lady Montrose shut her eyes for the briefest moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Evelyn." The girl's breath caught in her throat. Victor spun to face her. "Evelyn," Poirot's voice was calm but firm. "Yes. The lost family, those who were ruined by Lord Montrose's deception, they did not disappear entirely, did they? Their bloodline remained. And as fate would have it, their descendant now stands among us." Evelyn shook her head. No, that's not." Poirot met her gaze. "Your real name is not Evelyn Graves, is it?" She looked stricken. Her lips parted in stunned silence. Poirot pressed on. "You were taken in by Graves when you were a child. He raised you, but you were not of his blood. You were the last remaining heir to the family your stepfather once served. And that letter, it proved everything." Lady Montrose's voice was hoarse. "I knew the moment I saw it. If Evelyn's lineage were exposed, if the truth came out, she would be the rightful heir to everything. Everything my husband built. And I could not let that happen." Clegg's expression darkened. "So you destroyed the evidence," she nodded. "I thought it would end there. But Graves, he wouldn't let it go." Poirot studied her carefully. "But you still deny killing him?" Her shoulders stiffened. "Because I did not." Poirot exhaled slowly. "Then the real murderer is still among us." Victor's voice was barely a whisper. "But who?" Poirot turned to Evelyn, his expression unreadable. "That, mon cher, is what we are about to find out." The room was thick with silence, each breath drawn as though the air itself had turned to stone. Poirot stood in the center, his sharp eyes scanning the faces before him. Lady Montrose had admitted to concealing the truth, but she had not committed murder. That left only one possibility. The true killer was still in the room, still hiding behind the web of deception they had so carefully woven. Poirot folded his hands, his voice smooth but unyielding. "Let us consider what we know, mes amis. Mr. Graves possessed a letter, one that revealed the hidden truth about Lord Montrose's past. This letter, if made public, would have stripped the Montrose family of everything, restoring Evelyn to her rightful place as heir to an estate that was stolen long ago. Lady Montrose, in her desperation, attempted to destroy this letter. But he lifted a finger. She did not kill Graves. No, his murder was far more calculated than an act of mere panic. Victor shifted uneasily. Then who did? His voice was tight, edged with something that sounded dangerously close to fear. Poirot turned, his gaze landing on Evelyn. She stood frozen, her face pale, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "you were the one person in this affair who had the most to gain and the most to lose." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. He stepped closer. "Consider, mes amis, how the crime was committed. Mr. Graves was found in his study. The cause of death, a single precise wound. There were no signs of a struggle. That tells us two things. First, that the killer was someone he trusted, someone he would not have feared allowing into his private space. And second, Poirot's eyes darkened, that the killer knew exactly what they were doing. Evelyn took a shaky breath. "You think I did it?" Her voice was soft, almost fragile. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the room, his words deliberate. "From the moment we began this investigation, the assumption has been that Graves was the key to this mystery, that his discovery of the letter led to his death. But what if, in truth, his murder was never about silencing him at all?" "Lady." Montrose inhaled sharply, her expression twisting into something between confusion and dawning horror. No, it can't be." Poirot stopped, turning to face Evelyn directly. "Mademoiselle, I ask you now, and I ask you only once. What was it that Graves told you the night he died?" Evelyn's lips trembled. He told me about the letter. He said it proved who I really was, and what else?" Poirot's voice remained calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it, a long pause. Then, in a barely audible whisper, Evelyn said, "He said he was going to give it to the authorities." Poirot gave a slow, knowing nod. "And that is when you realized something terrible, did you not? That if the truth came out, you would not simply inherit a fortune." He paused, letting the moment stretch unbearably. "You would be forced to reckon with the past. A past that was not as simple as Graves had always told you." Evelyn's breathing quickened. "I don't know what you mean." Poirot took another step closer, his voice lowering. "But you do. You see, mademoiselle, Mr. Graves was not merely your guardian. He was a man with his own secrets. Secrets he had kept even from you." He turned slightly, addressing the others. "I have spoken with those who knew Graves in his youth, and one thing has become clear. He was more than an observer to the Montrose affair. He was a participant." Victor blinked. "What?" Poirot nodded. "Graves was not just a loyal servant seeking justice for a lost heir. He was complicit in the deception that robbed Evelyn's family of their inheritance in the first place." He turned back to Evelyn. "And when you realized that, mademoiselle, when you understood that the man you had trusted all your life had been one of the very people who had ensured your family's ruin, you were overcome with rage." Evelyn's eyes shimmered with something between fury and despair. "No," Poirot's voice softened. You did not kill Graves to silence him. You killed him because you could not bear the truth. He had kept you in the dark for years, making you believe you were fighting for justice, when in reality, he had been one of the reasons you suffered in the first place. And so, when he told you he would go to the authorities, you saw it not as salvation, but as a final betrayal. Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean to." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Perhaps not at first. But the moment you took that letter, the moment you confronted him in the study, the moment he admitted to his sins, it became inevitable." He sighed. "You picked up the letter opener from his desk. It was quick, precise. The wound was meant to be clean, to be final. The room was deathly still." Victor shook his head slowly. "Evelyn," she collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I loved him," she whispered. "He was the only family I ever had. And then he took that away from me. I wasn't even thinking. A sob racked her body. I just wanted it to stop." Poirot let out a slow breath. "And so it does, mademoiselle." The weight of the revelation settled upon them all, pressing down like an unseen force. Lady Montrose remained silent, her face unreadable. Victor looked stricken, torn between grief and disbelief. Clegg stepped forward. "Evelyn Graves, you are under arrest for the murder of Henry Graves." She didn't resist. There was no fight left in her. Poirot turned away as Clegg secured the cuffs around her wrists. Another case closed. Another truth brought into the light. But as he watched Evelyn being led away, he felt no triumph, only the heavy inevitable sorrow that came when justice was served too late to save anyone at all. As Evelyn was led away, the weight in the room remained, heavy and inescapable. The case was closed, or so it seemed. Poirot stood still, his mind turning over every detail, every thread in the intricate tapestry that had led them here. Something felt unfinished, like a note left unresolved at the end of a song. He had solved the crime, yes. Evelyn had confessed. And yet, as he glanced once more around the drawing-room, a lingering unease remained. Lady Montrose had barely moved since the confession. Her face was drawn, her hands still trembling at her sides. Victor looked shaken, but not entirely surprised. Clegg, ever efficient, had stepped aside to speak to his officers. The quiet murmurs of the constables filled the air, punctuated by Evelyn's soft, hitching breaths as she was led out of sight. Poirot's gaze flicked toward the fireplace, where the remnants of the letter had been found. His mind retraced the sequence of events, the discovery, the reactions, the unfolding of truth. And then it hit him. A single nagging detail that did not fit. He turned sharply. "Stop, Clegg." Halfway out the door with Evelyn, turned back. "Poirot, what now? You got your confession." Poirot's voice was firm. "And yet, something is amiss. There is a final question that has not been answered." Lady Montrose exhaled shakily. "What are you talking about?" "You already have." The murderer. Poirot stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Do we?" Victor stiffened. "Of course, we do. You proved it." "Evelyn," he gestured toward where she was being held. "She admitted it." Poirot nodded slowly. "Oh, but you see, admissions are not always the whole truth. There is a piece of this puzzle that remains out of place." He turned toward Clegg. "The letter, Chief Inspector. What did it contain?" Clegg frowned. "You already know." "It proved Evelyn's claim to the Montrose estate." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but that is only part of the truth. Tell me, Chief Inspector, was there any indication that Graves was about to reveal another secret one, perhaps even more damning than the theft of the Montrose fortune?" Clegg hesitated. "What are you getting at?" Poirot clasped his hands. "We have been looking at this case through the wrong lens. We assumed that Graves was killed for the letter, but let us think if Evelyn merely wished to silence him. Why take the risk of a murder that could so easily lead back to her? No, mon ami, Graves was not simply an obstacle to Evelyn. He was a threat to someone else. Someone who could not afford for another truth to be uncovered, Lady Montrose made. A soft, strangled sound. Poirot turned to her. The night Graves died, what exactly did he tell you? Her lips parted, but no words came. Poirot's voice was soft, almost gentle. Madam, you destroyed that letter, yes? But tell me, was it truly the only secret Mr. Graves held? Lady. Montrose swallowed hard. I don't know. You do, Poirot said, stepping closer. And you are afraid. Not for yourself, but because you realized something the moment Evelyn confessed. You realized that the murder was not committed for the reasons we believed. Victor stepped forward. Poirot, what are you saying? Poirot's eyes locked onto Lady Montrose's. I am saying that the true mastermind of this crime is still in this room. The silence was suffocating. Poirot continued, his voice measured. Consider Mies Amis. Evelyn may have struck the fatal blow, but why? Because she believed Graves had betrayed her. Because she was driven to act in a moment of rage. But what? If that moment was not entirely her own? Victor scoffed. That's ridiculous. Poirot tilted his head. Is it? His eyes gleamed. Tell me, Monsieur Montrose, where were you the night Graves was killed? Victor hesitated. I was in my study. Poirot smiled faintly. Oh, yes, the study. And before that? Victor's throat bobbed. Poirot turned abruptly, addressing the entire room. Evelyn was not the only one who visited Graves that night. Someone else spoke to him before she arrived. Someone who made sure that when she did, her fury would already be at its breaking point. Lady Montrose's face drained of color. Victor. Tell me he's wrong. Victor's hands clenched. I have no idea what he's talking about. Poirot let the accusation settle before delivering his final blow. Victor Montrose, you manipulated Evelyn into killing Graves. Victor's nostrils flared. That's absurd. Non, Poirot said calmly. It is not. You knew about the letter, but more importantly, you knew that Graves held more than one secret. It was not just the inheritance that threatened your family, it was what Graves was about to confess. And so, you went to him first. You made sure. He told Evelyn about his betrayal, about how he had played a part in her family's downfall. You fed her rage, knowing exactly how she would react. Victor sneered. You expect anyone to believe that? Poirot met his gaze without flinching. But of course. Because you made one mistake, Victor stilled. Poirot continued, his voice low. The murder weapon was a letter opener from Graves' own desk. But the position of the wound, the angle, it was too precise for a crime of passion. Evelyn lashed out. Yes, but the killing blow. That was deliberate, Lady Montrose gasped. No, Victor took a step back, shaking his head. You're lying. Poirot nodded toward Clegg. Chief Inspector, you'll find that Mr. Montrose was seen near Graves' study shortly before the murder. He made sure Evelyn found the letter, made sure she confronted Graves, but it was he who delivered the final strike. Victor's face contorted with fury. "You have no proof," Poirot simply smiled. "Oh, but I do. You see, Evelyn burned the letter. Yes, but there was something she did not destroy. The envelope." Clegg's eyes widened. "We still have it." Poirot nodded. "And on that envelope, I suspect you will find Victor Montrose's fingerprints. Proof that he handled it before Evelyn ever arrived." Victor's breath hitched. His gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape. But there was none. Clegg stepped forward. "Victor Montrose, you are under arrest." Lady Montrose covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "How could you?" Victor's face twisted in fury. "I did it for us, for our family. Graves was going to ruin everything." He, Poirot, exhaled. "And so, you let Evelyn take the fall." Victor's shoulders sagged. He had lost .as. He was led away. Poirot turned to Lady Montrose. "Your son was willing to sacrifice an innocent life to protect his own." "I am sorry, madam." She closed her eyes, as if hoping the darkness might swallow her whole. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Another case, another tangled web unraveled. The truth had been revealed, but as always, it came at a price. As Victor Montrose was led away, the heavy silence in the room remained, thick with unspoken words and fractured trust. Lady Montrose had collapsed into a chair, her hands trembling in her lap. Evelyn stood frozen near the doorway, her face blank with disbelief, her breath shallow. She had spent the last hour believing herself to be the murderer, only to discover that she had been nothing more than a pawn in Victor's scheme. Poirot watched her carefully. Of all those in the room, she had the most to process. Chief Inspector Clegg gave Poirot a long look before stepping aside to confer with his officers. The weight of the night had settled into his shoulders. He had come expecting a single murderer and had instead uncovered a deeper conspiracy. Poirot knew the feeling well. No matter how many cases one solved, the moment when justice was served was never as simple as it should have been. Poirot turned to Evelyn. "Mademoiselle, you are free." She blinked at him as if the words did not make sense. "Free?" Her voice cracked. "How can I be free when my hands are still stained with blood?" Poirot's gaze softened. "You did not kill Graves." "Yes." "You struck him, but it was not the fatal blow. Victor manipulated you, guided your rage so that you would act as he needed. But you are not a murderer, mademoiselle." Evelyn took a step back, her hands curling into fists. "I don't know what to do with that," she whispered. Poirot inclined his head slightly. "You will in time." Lady Montrose let out a soft, broken sob. "My son." Her voice wavered. I knew he was troubled, but I never thought." She turned to Poirot, her eyes pleading. Did he truly mean to let Evelyn take the fall? Poirot's expression was unreadable. "Madam, I do not believe he cared who suffered, so long as it was not him." She exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her chest as if struggling to breathe. "I raised him better than that." Poirot hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. "Perhaps, madam, but I fear you also taught him that reputation was more valuable than truth. Lady Montrose flinched before another word could be spoken. An officer entered hastily, his face pale. He approached Clegg and whispered something hurriedly into his ear. Clegg's entire body stiffened. Poirot narrowed his eyes. "What is it, Chief Inspector?" Clegg turned, his mouth set in a grim line. "Montrose." "He's gone." Evelyn's head snapped up. "What?" Poirot's pulse quickened. "Explain." Clegg swore under his breath. The constables were leading him to the car when a carriage came barreling down the road. The horses nearly trampled one of my men. In the chaos, Montrose broke free. Poirot's mind worked quickly. "And the carriage?" "Gone," Clegg muttered. Someone was waiting for him. Poirot exhaled sharply. The pieces clicked into place, too, neatly. Victor Montrose had been prepared for this possibility. His guilt had been undeniable, but he had never intended to face the consequences. Somewhere along the way, he had ensured an escape route. Evelyn ran a hand through her hair, laughing bitterly. "So that's it. He just disappears?" Clegg's jaw tightened. "We'll find him." Poirot remained silent for a long moment, then shook his head. "Perhaps, but men like Victor do not simply vanish. They reappear in another place, under another name, spinning new lies. He will not stay in hiding forever." Lady Montrose closed her eyes, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Evelyn crossed her arms tightly, her body rigid. "And what about me?" She turned to Poirot. "What happens to me now?" Poirot studied her. "That is for you to decide. Mademoiselle, you have been given a second chance. See that you use it well." She swallowed hard, nodding once. Clegg gestured to his men. "We'll send out word. Set up roadblocks. He won't get far." But even as he spoke, there was doubt. In his voice, Poirot gave a small, knowing sigh. "No, Chief Inspector. I suspect we will not see Victor Montrose again. At least, not until he decides it is time." The case had been solved. The truth had been revealed. But as Poirot watched the storm clouds gathering beyond the estate windows, he knew this was not the satisfying conclusion one might expect. Justice had been delivered, but not completely. There was always unfinished business where men like Victor Montrose were concerned. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. He had won this round. But the game, it seemed, was not over. As Poirot stepped outside. The crisp evening air carried the scent of damp earth and fading autumn leaves. The Montrose estate loomed behind him, its grand façade now merely a hollow shell of secrets laid bare. The case was solved, yet Poirot could not shake the feeling that something remained unresolved. Chief Inspector Clegg stood beside him, his posture stiff with frustration. "We'll send word to every port and border crossing. Montrose won't stay hidden for long." Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. "Perhaps, but he has resources, connections. He has planned this too well," he sighed. "Men like Victor do not wait to be found." Clegg exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "Damn it all, Poirot. We had him." Poirot turned his gaze to the carriage tracks still imprinted in the damp soil. "Yes, Chief Inspector. And yet he slipped away like a shadow at dusk." Clegg scowled but said nothing. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and prepared to leave when Evelyn approached. She had been quiet since Montrose's escape, her face a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something distant. "There's something I don't understand," she said. Poirot arched a brow. "Ah, and what troubles you, mademoiselle?" She hesitated, as if piecing together her own thoughts. "Victor planned this, didn't he? Right from the start?" "Oui," Poirot said. "From the moment he killed Graves, he set the stage to mislead, to deceive." She nodded slowly, biting her lip. "Then why frame me?" Poirot studied her, his keen eyes searching. "Because you were perfect, mademoiselle. Your past, your anger, your grief, it all made you a believable suspect. Victor understood that a crime is not merely about the evidence. It is about the story." Evelyn looked away. "He was always so good at that, making people believe what he wanted them to." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Indeed." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then Evelyn frowned. "But why did he run?" Poirot tilted his head. "Pardon, if he thought he could manipulate his way out, why did he have an escape plan at all?" Her voice was careful, measured. "It's almost as if he knew it would come to this." Poirot's gaze sharpened. A single puzzle piece, previously overlooked, clicked into place. Evelyn wasn't wrong. Victor Montrose had exuded confidence, had sneered at the very idea of being caught. Yet, from the moment the truth was revealed, he had shown no signs of shock, only readiness. As if he had expected this outcome all along. Poirot turned back to the estate, his sharp mind tracing the steps of the investigation once more. The confession, the deception, the escape, it had all been a game. But was Victor truly the only player? Clegg caught his expression and frowned. "Poirot, what is it?" Poirot tapped his chin. "Chief Inspector, tell me, did we ever confirm the true identity of the carriage driver?" Clegg blinked. "What, the carriage?" Poirot said, his voice quiet but firm. "The one that took Montrose away. Did we question the driver before he vanished?" Clegg's frown deepened. "No, we were too focused on Montrose." Poirot nodded, already following the thread unraveling before him. "Then I fear we have overlooked something. Or someone." Evelyn's breath hitched. "You think someone else helped him escape?" Poirot turned his gaze to the dark horizon, where Montrose had disappeared into the night, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Non, mademoiselle. I think someone expected him to escape." The words hung in the air like a warning. Clegg muttered a curse under his breath. "You mean there's another player in this mess?" Poirot's eyes glimmered with a quiet certainty. "Tell me, Chief Inspector, when a man prepares an escape plan, does he not also prepare for what comes after?" Clegg's face paled slightly. "You think someone is waiting for him?" Poirot gave a small nod. "We?" Evelyn clenched her jaw. "But who?" Poirot did not answer immediately. His mind worked through the puzzle, searching for the missing thread. Then he turned back to the estate, his gaze landing on the upper windows, where a single candle still flickered.